Yeah.
Slide.
Okay, wonderful, thank you. So I just want to talk about a set of buildings and a set of people who are very close by. This is the library of St Augustine's Missionary College, which will be familiar to anyone who is a student at Canterbury Christchurch or works at Canterbury Christchurch University. And the Missionary College is interesting, I think, because it connects Canterbury with much of the globe in the 19th century. I'm going to say something about the location, the place itself, and how the place sits on the map. I'm going to put it in some sort of context, but I'm also going to say something about the various people who have come through. It's a very interesting set of buildings. This set of buildings actually opens in 1848. If you look at the date over the prison gate, the prison is 1808, so the prison is 40 years older than what looks like a medieval building here, because of course this is a Gothic revival building, and it's important to sort of understand the Missionary College as a symbol of what that Gothic revival was all about. So this is our first key figure, Alexander James Hope. Later on, he is Alexander James Beresford Hope, with his own surname double-barrelled with itself. And if anyone knows Kilndown out in West Kent, that is where he is buried, in one of the great sort of Gothic revival, Iron Gothic actually, churches which he built down there, along with his wife, who was the sister of Lord Salisbury. He is very well connected. He is the sort of independently minded Tory MP out in Tunbridge Wells. So what's he doing in Canterbury in the 1840s? He's busy buying the Abbey ruins. He's busy buying the Abbey ruins for particular purposes. What happens is that the Abbey ruins are basically in a state of disrepair, and they think, what shall we do with these? And because the Anglican Communion is going through a sort of a messy stage of unplanned expansion, and there's the sense of a need for a proper training facility for Anglicans worldwide. This is when Australia has one bishop and not too many priests, so there's a need to supply the demand. Coleridge's nephew has the idea of the Missionary College, which is why we have the Coleridge buildings named after Coleridge's nephew, who is intimately tied up with the Missionary College project. Beresford Hope is still young, and he hires a very young architect, William Butterfield, to work on this new project. Some of the buildings are the old buildings, but some of them, like the library, are brand new buildings, which they decide to plan and design together. Interestingly, they do some archaeological work on the site. They raise lots of the roofs so they're a bit steeper, and put together all sorts of different things. This is before Butterfield is famous, and the work they do together leads to the opening of the brand new Missionary College. There's quite an event which takes place at its opening, and it's quite a statement. If you walk down the road there, you will notice on the opposite side of the road, Melbourne Terrace, which is much more Victorian, and being Melbourne Terrace, much more Whig. And facing it, in contrast to it, is the Tory reaction, which is medievalist and Gothic. Inside, they're trying to recreate an abbey space, And here's a picture which also shows Butterfield's new building, the library, alongside some of the restoration work that they've been doing. So what's the Gothic revival all about? Well, we all know the name of Pugin, who of course we know is out in Ramsgate. Here's a picture from Pugin's own contrasts, in which you can see Pugin at the top presenting what a proper Gothic town should look like, and then the terrible results of modernisation and what goes wrong with your architecture, which is no longer dominated by church spires, but is instead dominated by chimneys. This is Pugin's vision. This is what we need: more churches. This is how we are going to restore England to its green and pleasant past. Because of course Victorian England with its red brick mills is not necessarily a pleasant place to be, and many look to the past for an alternative. So you wander around where we are and look at the churches, and of course many of the churches aren't particularly old, whether it's St Greg's or whichever one you're looking at. These are Victorian buildings trying to find an alternative to Victorian red brick. Incidentally, very often it's a kind of green alternative. If you've ever thought about Victorian Floriat design, Pugin actually said that he went to one of the European cathedrals and asked the stonemason there, well, where'd you get your designs? And he said, well, I just take plaster casts of leaves. The idea being that God designed the leaves, so we just work from the template, and the more green that you can get into the church, the better, which is a very interesting idea. Reading the Gothic spaces is actually green spaces, and Emma Mason at Warwick has written on that theme quite extensively. There's something else here. Apologies, my quite an out of focus picture there. Here we have two of the Young England novels, Coningsby and Sybil, the other one being Tancred, of course. The first one, Coningsby, is actually dedicated to Alexander James Hope's brother, Henry Hope. And if you know either Coningsby or indeed even more impressively in Sybil, let's take the example of Sybil. The central scene in Sybil is when the protagonist is at a ruined abbey and meets a mysterious young woman, and they start to have a discussion of the two Englands, which are divided, the two nations divided between the rich and the poor. And of course the solution arrived at in Sybil is that there should instead be one nation. But this is a discovery, a disclosure, a revelation made amongst the abbey ruins. So the fact that Coningsby is actually dedicated to Hope's elder brother is suggestive that when Alexander James Hope is buying up the abbey ruins here, it's the Young England project, and you actually have to think about what they're doing as part of that context. It's the Young England Disraeli Tory reaction trying to get back to a past which was seen as better, and in which the church was the place where alms was offered and there was a sense of community and the rest of it. So it is a Young England project, and it is no mistake, therefore, that if you think about it, the college opens in 1848, which is the year of revolutions, whilst nations in Europe are revolting. Here is a political statement of a return to the past. I know lots of people here will know the Communist Party manifesto by heart, and because you do so, you'll know that Marx and Engels refers to the alternatives available at the time, including Young England and clerical socialism, something which of course Marx disapproves of, but he's aware of it. So it's on that, you know, sort of menu of different political possibilities which people are exploring at the time. Marx's, of course, ends in terrible failure, but Disraeli's one nation Toryism, as we know, is meeting with a great deal of success at the moment. The next project that Hope and Butterfield together then engage on is actually architecturally the really significant one, because having done the Missionary College buildings, they then go off to All Saints Margaret Street, which if you know anything about architectural history, some architectural historians will describe it as one of the 10 most influential buildings in the British Isles, precisely because it's the great early example of the industrial Gothic revival. All of this black and red tiling, which I think lots of us do associate with Victorian buildings. Actually, All Saints Margaret Street was the great early example of it. And although, you know, for much of the 20th century, this sort of thing was terribly out of fashion, its influence nevertheless was incredible. So they're quite restrained here in what they're doing with the Missionary College on the Abbey site, and then when they go up to London, they just go mad for it. Anyway, one of the interesting spaces underneath the Missionary College buildings, Beresford Hope actually instructs there to be built a crypt underneath in what's much more, if you've looked at the All Saints Margaret Street picture, this is much more of that sort of style, red and black, and it's a very, very interesting space. If you go around Canterbury, if you go into Canterbury Cathedral, you'll find a monument to English religious history, with the occasional nod to global religious history. It's really underneath the Missionary College in this space that you see the global Anglican Communion being brought together. If you look at the walls, what you'll see here are a whole series of memorial inscriptions, memorials of different missionaries trained at the college who then went out to various parts of the globe. And some of them are very interesting indeed. Here we have Erasmus, Augustine, Kalihiru, whose story is quite tragic. He arrived from 76 degrees north, which Peter will know is quite far north. And that's because he's picked up by the Royal Navy as they're navigating up past Newfoundland. And then when the sea freezes over, they can't get him back. So the Royal Navy takes the decision, what should we do with him? Well, we'll take him to Canterbury. So it's this sort of, he's basically removed from his people and ends up here. I mean, and it means that you've got someone who is from the Inuit, what used to be called the Eskimo peoples, who is here in Canterbury in 1851, wandering around the spaces where we are now. He gets baptised at St Martin's Church. We have a few records of things which interested him. Some of his books are still kept in the cathedral archives. And then, as you'll see, he actually went off to Newfoundland as a missionary himself, and died very shortly afterwards. A lot of the missionaries do die very shortly after they've arrived at their new destinations. We also have people coming from, well, here's Jeremiah Libupua Mashweshu, who comes from Lesotho, comes to the Missionary College 1861. And you'll see here he dies in Hereford. But why does he die in Hereford? He's taken to Hereford to complete his education at a grammar school. And whilst there, he catches, I think TB or something, and dies a couple of years later, and is buried in the graveyard. Yeah, there. And the Lesotho royal family occasionally do come over to Herefordshire to visit the grave. So if you look at the news reports, you'll see that there's still a sort of a pilgrimage site from southern Africa to Hereford. Mashreshu's father was a very, very important king of Lesotho. And here he is, because one of the other things that we can do is match up photo portraits that we have of them with the actual records. And this is where some of the memorial inscriptions actually come to life, when you can actually put the faces to some of the people who were here in Canterbury in the early 1860s. The earliest record of a black student to Mackenzie is from 1852. Here's another good example, Shapurji Adalji. He is Parsi, so he comes from India, comes to train at St Augustine's here, and then gets himself a Shropshire parish. So he is an Anglican vicar in a rural English parish from the 1870s. He is also the subject of the Julian Barnes novel, Arthur and George. I could see in one of your slides referenced up, can Arthur Conan Doyle come and solve this mystery? It's Sir Purge's son George Idalji, who falls victim to some quite terrible racism. He gets falsely accused of wounding cattle and arrested and is imprisoned for it. Arthur Conan Doyle at that time sort of spots there's some curiosities about this, and himself gets involved in the case and gets George, the son of Shapurji Adalji, acquitted, and they set up the Court of Appeal in the process. Julian Barnes's novel Arthur and George is based on it. So interestingly, when it came to the ITV dramatisation of it, Art Malik played Shapurji Adalji, so it's very, very interesting little story. And also quite suggestive of questions of race and religious identity in the 1870s, 1880s, 1890s. We also have individuals, I'll just pick out a few, Francis Buddhazan from Syria. Here is Morat Khan Nanishu and his wife Sada Nanishu, who are from Persia. Like many of the missionaries, one of the things that Morat Khan Nanishu is really remembered for is setting up schools in Persia. So many indeed that the Shah gave him the title Father of the Nation. They tend to get trained in schoolwork. They get trained in the use of printing presses. They get trained in surgery. And many of the missionaries are go into schools-related activity. The Reverend J.H.D. Paul, I'm going to bring in here an example of a West Indian missionary. So from the Caribbean originally, comes to England, trains as a missionary, and then is a missionary in Africa. So you suddenly get a picture of Canterbury being a place where people are coming into and then going out to other destinations. And with that, you start to get the sense of the beginning of a globally related Anglican communion, where for a period it seems that people training for Anglican ministry wherever they are in the world, if they are fortunate, get to do their 2 years in Canterbury, which must make Canterbury quite a heavily internationalised place in the 1860s and the 1870s. Very, very interesting to reflect upon that and think about that as a point. With some of these individuals, you sort of go, yes, that is a tragic story. I sometimes, sort of reflecting on it, I think it's also a great opportunity if you grant people agency. If you say, okay, are you just being completely colonised, or do you have agency in a choice to go to Canterbury and explore and come back? Then there are sort of some quite curious dual identities which get built around some of these individuals. I would say about Duport, actually, that the other thing that tends to happen is they tend to write grammars and dictionaries for languages. So a lot of the Victorian knowledge of languages seems to have been associated with training in transcribing languages done through done at the Missionary College. Fortunato Hosa, another interesting individual. He's actually from Italy. He's from the Vatican State. He comes to Canterbury to convert to Anglicanism. He then goes out to Guyana, and then retires to Cornwall, where he was fondly remembered singing opera, Italian opera, whilst wandering up and down the cliffs. And one of the really interesting things that we've got to do is to dig through the archives and find out a little bit more about some of the individuals who are in the photograph albums. For instance, the Reverend Majaliwa, we've got his photograph here. He's a very, very important figure in the sort of east of Africa, with quite a full Wikipedia entry on him, with all sorts of fascinating things that he does. Quite quickly, you start to see some of the tensions between the white church hierarchy and some of the black missionary priests in Africa. But it tells a story that the black missionary priests are actually so successful in establishing African forms of Christianity. In other words, although they might have a lot to complain about, they actually persist with an African Christianity which of course endures. This is I think one of those images where a picture can speak 1,000 words. This is Gregory Mpua Nchobo, who and this is the college cricket team in 1897, sorry. Gregory Nchobo is a Zulu. He just after the Zulu victory at Rorke's Drift, he gets brought across to England. So you can sort of like, is this forced enculturation of the youth? Quite possibly. He gets placed in Hurstpierpoint College in Sussex, and then comes to St Augustine's Missionary College. So by this time he's sort of anglicised, if I can put it that way, through his public school education. He passes the university entrance exam for Holy Orders, which is suggestive of his own intellectual abilities, because lots of the students don't. And then he goes back off as a missionary to Zululand. And we notice that near Rorke's Drift there is actually a St Augustine's church with a St Augustine's school and a St Augustine's hospital. And it's one of those where you sort of think, well, there has to be a link between St Augustine's Canterbury and St Augustine's Rorke's Drift. Here's another picture of Nchobo. This is the Freshers photo from 1895, which I think is quite a lovely image. I don't know why Freshers Week doesn't look like this anymore. Nathaniel Cyril Condile Mala, I think, is perhaps the most significant person to have come across this site in the last 200 years or so. Mala's story is again sort of quite terrible. Mala's father is a very significant chief who is imprisoned after the Kosa cattle killing on Robben Island. The sons get taken away and placed at Zunneblum College, which is sort of Anglican school. So again, you might say, well, forced enculturation. But Mala gets then given the chance to go to Canterbury. And you might say, well, okay, let's go and see the world. So he comes up to Canterbury, 1867. According to his Kosa biographer, he gets the opportunity to go to Westminster, to Parliament, to listen to Disraeli and Gladstone debating. They actually get something about politics there. He also gets something about Anglican choral music, and he gets something about cricket. He then goes back to South Africa, back to the Eastern Cape. He is, you know, he remains an Anglican catechist, so he's teaching in Anglican Church doctrine. But then in the Ninth Frontier War, he gets charged with high treason by the colonial authorities. I think it's because he's been talking to his brother. Then he gets acquitted. Once he's acquitted, he goes off to work in a legal office. He sets up the first Kosa language newspaper, Iswi Lenatu, and he also sets up something called the SANC, which is the South African Native Congress, which within not very long becomes the African National Congress, the ANC. So if you look at histories of the founding of the ANC, Mala is actually really very significant. The other thing that he also does is he's a member of a group which says there needs to be a black university, and they then go and set up Fort Hare University. And I found something which Nelson Mandela wrote, saying that when he was imprisoned on Robben Island, they took inspiration from Chief Mala, who had been also imprisoned there. Little did he know that the son was playing cricket on the green fields of England. So it's a very interesting set of circumstances there. And I think we need an enormous statue to Mala to memorialise him. But anyway, at that point, I ought to stop. There are over 1,000 student records for us to work through, so we've got quite a large project. But I will stop at this point.
Thank you. I think